Christianity Today has once again stepped in it as they released a brand new article advocating that Christians send their kids to public school. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I'll be joined by Pastor Chase Davis to discuss why public schools should not be trusted with raising the next generation of faithful Christians. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am joined by Chase Davis. So Chase, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience for those who are not yet familiar.
Hey, my name is Chase Davis. I'm a pastor in Boulder, Colorado of the Well Church. We are a Southern Baptist church, and I host Foolproof Theology, a podcast of my own, where I have interesting conversations with guests, and you can find me on Twitter at jchasedavis.com.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, feel free to head on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is home for our podcast. You can put in your email there for free and get everything sent to your email as each podcast drops. Then, of course, you can like and share this video. It does really help boost us in the algorithms. And follow me on Twitter at ForgeandA for additional content and updates on the show. That being said, let's get straight into it. So, yeah, Chase, I know you saw the article. I saw the article. But for those who are not yet familiar, I'll go ahead and just read out the title of the article by Christianity Today. It says, "Public school can be a training ground for faith." So I've got a whole lot of initial reactions there, but Chase, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. I'll give you the first chance to react to the title and just your overall thoughts when you saw the article drop.
My overall thoughts were my reply on Twitter, which was a gif of, I think it was Saved by the Bell. I wasn't even allowed to watch that when I was a kid because I was so sheltered, of somebody saying that's stupid, because it's just like, this is so old hat. This is what they always say. Jen Wilkin, she even references Jen Wilkin in the article. I have this conversation a lot with Christians, even in my context, and they make the exact same argument. Well, you see, I was raised Christian. Then when I went to the secular university, then my faith was really tested. My faith became my own. And therefore, it's good to send kids to public school. And nearly all these parents I talk to actually don't send their kids to public school. They're just trying to make an apologetic. And so, yeah, it's nonsense. It's not clear. It's not helpful. She tries to pull some statistical stuff on homeschooling and socialization, using her own story and how she got bullied for her faith and all this kind of stuff. And it's wild. It's unhelpful. And of course, it comes from Christianity Today, where they want to provide cover. And that's what makes me really angry is you've got this author who, posted a black square in 2020 celebrating Black Lives Matter. And she's the theological editor for Christianity Today. She has a PhD. And so well-meaning sheep will see this. Christianity Today has a legacy. It's a Christian publication that has a legacy in America with evangelicals. So they'll see this and think, well, it's Christianity Today. They're not bad people. They really want to make a good case. And this is a smart person. They have a PhD. Shoot, I should really listen to this. And it's just not well thought out. And unfortunately, I think it twists scripture in it too, to justify the point of view. You could make the case, but I think the way the case is being made is pretty poor. Especially given our current context. I mean, given our current context, what you've got is colleges of education and secular universities training up teachers and sending them out to rural areas where, they get their first few reps in teaching, and they've already been indoctrinated at the local madrasa to learn these secular ways of transgenderism and Black Lives Matter. Then they go out to rural Colorado, rural Texas, rural Tennessee, and they go into these schools. Not only that, but the school districts themselves are federally funded. They receive government funding for certain agendas, for them to push certain agendas and curriculum, particularly in sexual education. And so if you send your kid in there, you're asking for more trouble in your life. And it's appealing to a lot of parents because they are kind of tied to a dink lifestyle where they have a 2-income household. And, what else are they going to do? Are we going to send them to private school? That's costs a lot. Are we going to homeschool? That means one of us has to quit our career, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I could keep rambling, but that was my initial here we go again. Christianity Today, trying to dupe evangelicals into kind of giving in to sending their kids off to the slaughter.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It really just does seem like, to your point, this author is someone who maybe personally had some great experiences with public school. I mean, I'm a product of the public school system, not my whole life. I similar to this author, I actually had multiple different modes that my school took place in. I did private school at the beginning, moved to public school, did homeschool for a year, moved back to public school, moved back to homeschool for another year, finished in public school my last few years of high school. I mean, I moved all over the place. So I really do think that I've got a pretty well-rounded perspective of the pros and cons of the different modes of schooling that a parent can choose. And I can honestly say that I had some positive interactions in public school. I had a lot of negative ones too. But I think one of the big things to keep in mind is this individual who's writing this draws upon their personal experience. And I think it's important to remember times have changed dramatically. Uh,
Yeah.
I've talked a lot on the show about Aaron Ren's his three worlds framework of positive world, neutral world, negative world. And so for those who are not familiar, just to quickly catch up to speed, it's the idea that positive world is Christianity is viewed in a positive way. There are social benefits for being a Christian. Neutral world is kind of you do you. You might say you're a Christian. That's great. You do you. I'm atheist, or I'm Mormon, or I'm a vegan. Whatever the case may be, you do you. And then about 2014 is where Aaron Wren puts it, where we've entered negative world with ushering in of things like Obergefell and other major landmarks that kind of usher in negative world, where it's now a negative to be seen as a Christian. You're now viewed as a threat to social norms. That's what the kids are currently living under. That is what we are in the midst of. So in my mind, if I want to steelman the author's arguments here, I want to immediately think, okay, sure, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and say that you had a great experience in public school. Well, let's look at what's changed in the public school system since you were in public school. For myself, I would have graduated high school in the very tail end of neutral world. And I could say that neutral world already is vastly different than negative world. The changes that have occurred since I've been out of school, there's no way in good conscience I could ever send my child to public school. But feel free to add any additional thoughts to that.
Yeah, I grew up graduating right smack dab in the middle of Bush, and I grew up in Christian school all my life. And so there was this sense, even as a young man, that, I wonder if I'm missing anything by not going to public school. Because the way evangelicals talk about reaching the lost, loving the lost, being missionaries, all that kind of stuff is very like pervasive in how Christians are reared. But I always went to Christian school, and I'm so thankful for that. I went to a secular university, although it's probably one of the more Christian universities in America, even more so than like Baylor. I think Texas A&M is probably more Christian than Baylor, but it was still secular. You encounter a lot of people there, a lot of different perspectives there, but yeah, I think this day and age, when you look around, I'm in Boulder County, Colorado, with Boulder Valley School District, St. Vrain School District, the state government. I mean, there's no escaping their agenda and what they're trying to push on Christians, how they discriminate against Christians, and you can't really do anything about it. Kids that have been in public school, that have been at my church, during Christmas, every other religion is allowed to celebrate their religion, but we're not allowed to celebrate. They're not allowed to do drawings or ornaments for Christians. And so it's a pervasive, dare I say, toxic. I hate using that word because that's what the left uses, but it's a terrible place to send children to. Now, the reason I think it appeals to so many normal evangelical Christians is they remember their upbringing. They go, there was football, there was homecoming, there was prom. There's all these core memories that they have of high school. And so they want that for their kid. And I don't blame them. I want that for my kid too. But if I have to choose between my sons playing football for the local public school or them getting a good Christian education, I know what I'm picking like every day, even if it costs me something, even if I have to homeschool, whatever it may be. And so I think, the times have definitely changed where, my mother-in-law was a public school teacher in a small town in Texas. And back then there was still prayer, there were normal Christian experiences. And now it's crazy out there. You've got the teacher union pushing certain agendas. It's just so bad. And so we don't like, I think I want to be clear on this episode. Like, I sympathize with Christian parents when they're faced with this choice. And I understand the financial cost and kind of like wanting to believe the best. And, it's not a requirement to be a member at my church that you have your kids not in public school. We have not gone that far, although some churches have, and I don't blame them for that. But I will say, like, the kids who go to public school have a worse outcome, both spiritually or anything else. Just one parent who pulled I was talking to him today at our church, pulled his kid out of public school last year, put him in a classical charter school, which is better, but still, charter, not fully Christian. But she has so many more Christian friends there, and she's so thankful that she's surrounded by Christian young people. And that's incredibly important for a young person. Young people are so impressionable. All people are impressionable, but especially during that age, middle school, high school. And it's super important that they're surrounded by people who, yeah, we can ask tough questions. We can do all this stuff, because in Christian schooling, you're going to get exposed. You're going to discuss those big things. And in my Christian school, we were discussing things like the Jesus seminar and liberal theology. We were discussing all these things and figuring out how to like engage with them biblically. And so this idea that Christian school somehow shelters you to a degree that you're inhibited from experiencing that kind of stuff or anything like that, it's a wrong premise. Unfortunate if she had that experience, but we can't judge it based on her experience. We have to judge it based on what we're dealing with here. And it's not just in Boulder, it's in Tennessee, it's in Texas, it's everywhere. These public schools are in many ways utterly corrupt. And again, I have members of my church who are in the public school as teachers, and God bless them for that. They're a light in a dark place. And so there's a place for that. I want them to do well in that. That can be hard, even as a Christian in a public school, because you yourself are subjected to trainings and curriculum that you may not agree with, and you may have very limited opportunity. But especially for young people, I mean, sending your kids into that kind of environment is sending sheep to the slaughter.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't take any delight in this, and it sounds like you don't either. I was driving by a public school just maybe a couple weeks ago with my wife, and I looked at the public school, and I remember telling my wife, I was like, man, if our culture was healthy, like I think about exactly what you laid out. I think about like how much I wish my kids can just have sort of a normal upbringing. But to some degree, that's kind of the benefit of positive world. Our parents thought it was normal, but the reality is it's not normal. I mean, the vast majority of our church history, Christianity has been on the fringes, not in the majority. It hasn't always been the dominant force of society, with the exception of course, this sort of period of time that we kind of refer to as Christendom. But outside of that, it's not the norm for kids to have all this this sort of extracurricular activities where they just get to participate in football with their friends and all this stuff that are true blessings of positive world. But positive world's no longer here, so now we have to recognize that we're a negative world and deal with it accordingly. I wanted to read part of the article here, because this is kind of an argument that I hear as well. So this is a couple paragraphs into the article here. First, though, this is her writing here from Christianity Today. I want to recognize this is a practical question as much as a theoretical one. We ultimately make our decisions based on the actual situation, options, and children before us. That means we're not talking about public school in general, but the specific public schools in our districts and the specific private Christian and or homeschool resources in our areas. And we're not talking about kids in general, but our specific kids. And we all know that every child has different needs. So take all that follows with the recognition that it may not be possible for you to make the same decision I would. So immediately I get the argument that she's making, but I think the thing to remember is we now live in such a connected society that to pretend that the public schools in Tennessee are light years better than the public schools in Illinois is just not the case. There might be some improvement because of maybe local school boards might be a little more conservative, but as a whole, it's the Department of Education that's dictating a lot of the curriculum. And thanks to connectivity through the internet, we have a non-Christian children are going to be consuming the same type of content, in all different states. We no longer, I think, can pretend that we can live in these small bubbles unless we intentionally seek out some form of shelter for our children to be incubated in before they are ready to go off into the real world. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the school boards generally are not that great. They're bureaucratic and they're funded federally. And so you can't get those federal dollars without agreeing. And I would even go so far as to say even the curriculum itself, the book publishers, if you look at the book publishers that the public schools are using, those book publishers, the way they write the curriculum, they write the American story, all this kind of stuff, it's deeply infused with liberal ideology. And so the teachers may unknowingly, may not be malicious in your area, but they're adopting these books that are intentionally educating children in ungodly manners, whether it's creation, sex, whatever it may be. So you're not going to escape it because even the publishers themselves are very much ideologically captured. And so you have to use explicitly Christian curriculum to supplement. You could make the argument, in your area, everyone on the school board is a Christian, but even then, with those federal dollars and the teachers you're getting and can hire, you're looking for, educators that are well credentialed from a highly esteemed secular university that have already adopted the kind of talking points, slogans, mantras, the approaches to education like ESG, that they're forming kids in a certain way. And so the teaching itself is, in my estimation, substandard normally the way they're taught. And so even if the school board is, let's say you had all Christians on a school board, those local schools, you could have like a high school principal as a Christian. He's still bringing in teachers from these secular universities who are educated with a liberal ideology, unless you want to go so far as to subtly discriminate, which none of them would openly do because that is technically illegal. Unless you want to like find explicitly Christian teachers, which are pretty unable to do. So it's just going to be very hard to avoid, getting into kind of the leftist indoctrination in these government schools.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wanted to read on too, because the very next paragraph, she says, "Our daughter is just a toddler, so she's not yet in school, and it's possible something in the next few years will lead us to change our minds. But for now, my husband and I have decided to send her to public school." So, first, I think it's important to note that I don't want to pretend that if you have young children that you don't have any wisdom. My children are also not yet of school age. I have young children as well. But I do think that that is something to note when you're writing an article on telling other parents, what they should or shouldn't do for their schooling. That is something that I think the reader is going to make note of. This individual does not actually have school age children, and they do not actually see the results of public school. So you could argue that that this individual has no real sway in her argument here until she can experience the anecdotal evidence as well. And I mostly just use that point because she uses anecdotal evidence for her experiences to kind of make her argument. And again, that would be her drawing upon going to school, probably, given her age, if I'm going to guess, at least neutral world, if not, possibly even positive world. I don't know the age of the author here, but it goes on to say, one of the most important considerations for me in making that choice is that studies show there are more important elements for building and safeguarding our kids' faith than the school they attend. As I've previously reported for Christianity Today, research suggests that taking children to church regularly matters more than finding the right school. I have thoughts on that. I don't disagree, but I'll let you take a crack at it first, Chase.
Yeah, I mean, yes, church is very important. Christians should be going to church every week, at least. And so going to worship the living God, hearing the preached word, incorporating family worship into your daily rhythms of life are very important things. And like you said, I mean, it's hard to hear this from somebody who has not yet experienced this themselves. This is more of a theorizing on the author's part. But yeah, I find it hard to believe. I think the author lives in the Atlanta metro area. You're not going to go into that elementary school and avoid these secular slogans, Black Lives Matter, transgender flags, all this kind of stuff. And so, like, why do you want to talk to your 5-year-old? Like, I don't, like, I have to do that in Boulder. When I take my kids to church, they typically come with me, and my wife brings the baby a little bit later. We're driving down and we're like, Dad, they're going, Dad, why does that church have a rainbow flag in front of it? And, you have to explain it, and you have to explain it biblically. I don't want to have to do that. Like, I will, because it's my job, but, like, I don't want my kids being exposed to that to a flag representing sodomy. Like, that's terrible for a young mind to be exposed to. It's the same logic that people use when they're like, want these books in schools that have pornographic content, and it's like they need to learn at a young age. It's like, no, they don't. Like, you don't have to do that. That's weird. And so I just find it hard to believe that that's going to be a positive experience for that child. Yes, children are very adept. They can grow, they can change, all this kind of stuff. But the argument really falls flat on its face for me.
Yep, I agree. She actually goes on to say another major consideration is that I would rather most of my child's first close encounters of the worldly kind happen while she's still under my roof, not after she leaves home. That preference is informed by my own unique education background. She does go on to essentially compare the idea of children encountering opposing worldviews as a sort of like weight training. Let me see if I can find that part here. She said, think of it like strength training. Your children need to build muscles of faith, and public school can provide weight to lift while you're around to spot them. Let them wrestle with worldly counter narratives to God's truth while they're still under your care. That may feel risky, but the alternative, keeping them sheltered, then letting them be exposed to everything all at once when they leave home for work or college, is too risky. So I think it's important to immediately talk about that analogy of strength training. In my mind, a more proper analogy of a parent spotting their child while they're, learning how to lift weights, if we're going to use that analogy, that to me looks more like the parent in a very controlled setting, meaning probably the home or possibly a private Christian education that they have a heavy hand in. Slowly introducing their child to these ideas and challenging them. I know a lot of individuals, again, because my children aren't school aged. A lot of my friends do have school age children, and they're talking about how they're going to make their children do essentially debate class where they're a Christian child and they are having to debate on abortion, and they're going to debate it on both sides of the issue. They're going to spend time advocating for abortion so that they can try to steelman that argument as much as possible, and then they're also going to be on the receiving end defending a pro-life stance. So to me that looks like weight training. But to pretend that putting your child into a situation where they are among a bunch of pagan, non-believing individuals all day long, including adults. I mean, let's talk about the teachers here, not even just their peers. To pretend that that's like being spotted under the bench press by their parent, I just really don't think that analogy holds. I think in reality, when you send your kids to a public school, you are sending them into open spiritual warfare. And so the issue is, you shouldn't, the scriptures talk about putting on the full armor of God. We shouldn't be sending children out there who, the helmet doesn't even fit them and they can't even carry their shield because they're a child. And we're saying, good luck, go be a light out in the world. I just think that is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's a total disaster. And when you can't put a kid in a weight room, we wouldn't treat kids this way in any other capacity. With strength training, you wouldn't treat them this way. I mean, it's an attempt at an analogy, and the analogy quickly falls apart if you do frame it like I think you accurately do with spiritual warfare. If you have a soldier, let's say me and you, I don't believe, Connor, you were never in the military, as far as I know, right?
No, I was
Okay.
not.
So if you took us two guys and just dropped us into a combat zone and expect us to just thrive, I would hope I would. Okay. I would hope I would. However, without any kind of basic training, without the right equipment, without the right materials, let's say they put a gun in my hand I've never used. They put all this gear on me that I've never used, night vision, which is cumbersome and heavy on my head, and then they drop me in that, and I'm supposed to work with a team to accomplish a mission. this is foolishness. This is not how we would treat anyone else. And it, again, it goes back to her premise. She believes that public schools, by and large, and Jen Wilkin makes the same argument based on her, experience in Texas, which she believes is more conservative. They make this argument, oh, it's good strength training, it's training them. And no, it's not a training ground, it's an indoctrination camp for the child to learn Caesar's ways, to learn leftist ideology, and in all facets, biology, history, all of it. And so you're not doing the child any favors. You're essentially sending a child to war, and they're not. That is not nearly criminal to do, to subject the child to that form of constant back and forth. Especially, it creates distrust because the child is spending what, seven, let's say seven at the least, 7 hours a day in a classroom, maybe with one teacher, maybe with multiple. And we're assuming a lot of those teachers are probably not Christian. And if they are, they're still teaching the kind of secular books, all this kind of stuff. Then they come home, and you think you're going to offset it by like an hour at home. Hey, what did they talk about at school today? And then you send them back the next day, 7 more hours of that. Like, it's just not feasible for that child. And it's sad for that child to experience that. It's not a blessing. And it's not just because you went out and you went to a secular university and all of a sudden, wow, I had to really question my faith. I mean, I'm glad God worked in your life in that way. That doesn't mean you should send your kids to the public schools so that they too, at age 5, can have to encounter that same thing at a very early age. It's lunacy to me. It's sad. Like I said, I sympathize and I understand the perspective, but I think it's just completely wrong.
Yeah, I agree. She talks about sheltering children, and she said something. I'm just going to read it again. She said, the alternative, keeping them sheltered, then letting them be exposed to everything all at once they leave home for work or college, is too risky. Look, I'm sure that there are individuals that have done a poor job with homeschooling that did just that. They sheltered their kid for everything, and then once they were 18, 19, however old, they just threw them out into the world, and college was probably a giant culture shock. But first of all, I mean, I'm not personally going to encourage my kids to go to college unless they are showing me that they have a real career path that requires college. But that's an aside. Either way, the point that we're going to shelter our kids and then just suddenly rip off the Band-Aid and expose them to all the worldly things all at once is just it's ridiculous. Again, like my point earlier, I plan to teach my kids. First, I'm going to try to develop their worldview and teach them, what I think is good, true, and beautiful. But then I do plan on exposing them. These are the alternate viewpoints out there that are going to come and attack your worldview. Here's their strongest arguments. What's your response to them? And I'm going to teach them how to understand those and combat them. And I'm planning on doing so with scripture. And of course, godly counsel. And that's ultimately what I think every Christian parent should be doing. She talked about, again, in the article, how church is more important. Going to church regularly is more important than school. I'm sure that's the case, because I think church, that if they're going and they're listening to a preacher preach from the word of God does not return void. We know that there's power in the word. So as long as it's a faithful church, I'm sure that that can have an outsized impact that can topple even a secular public school system. But regardless, if we're just talking about hours spent, to your point earlier, we're talking 30 hours bare minimum that they're spending in this public school, and probably 4 to, maybe if they do midweek activities too, maybe 4 to 8 if we're being extremely generous, of how many hours are spent in church. But realistically, it's probably something more like 4 hours compared to 40, 45, 50 if they do extracurricular stuff like sports and, after school, before school activities, bus rides, things of that nature. I mean, the equation just does not add up. To pretend that they can have thousands and thousands of hours, underneath secular teachers with secular peers, and we just hope that just their church is going to be, their time at church is going to be enough to undo all that. That's not the case. Now, I think you can make a case for a parent being heavily involved, making sure that they're having regular family dinners, every single night. And, there's a case that you can make where you can do public school. And I think you can do it in a way that's maybe not sinful. But, at the end of the day, I just think out of the options, it is the worst option to pick between homeschooling, private education, charter schools, and public schools. And that's just what I think Christians really need to be considering when it comes time for them to choose what mode they're going to use for their child's education.
Yeah, well, even thinking about how it's always framed as sheltered. You don't want to be sheltered. You don't want to be weird. And I'm like, I remember going 2 years ago, I went to Top Golf, playing with my family, playing some Top Golf, good times. And I look over and you got this Amish family, and they're dressed in Amish attire, very, conservative attire. On the other side, you've got purple hair, skimpy attire, and I'm like, I used to look at the Amish family and go, gosh, they're so weird. And I'm like, no, like I that's great. Like good. They're not like crazy. They're living into their own tradition. They're living into their own, and the same thing with the secular left. It just so happens the Amish family has more in common with Christianity. But like this idea that kids are somehow sheltered. I grew up going to Christian school K through 12. I would not consider myself sheltered. Like movies, music, all that kind of stuff we're naturally exposed to. You play on sports teams with public school kids. You have neighborhood friends that don't go to Christian school. Kids are going to get exposed to this stuff, whether you are you in charge of that exposure or not. Like when my sons and they see the kids on the block who are down the road who are non-Christians and they have cell phones at age 9, and they're watching YouTube and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, my sons are going, why don't we have cell phones? And I have to explain to them, and I have to say, you're not allowed to watch their phone. If they pull it out, you're not allowed to be there. If he gets out his phone, come home. Like that, this idea that a child is somehow, until they're 18, they're just very like, they live in a cave and they don't know anything about the world. Like that's insane. Like that's not how 99% of Christian kids who are being raised in a Christian education are experiencing life. You want to it's your job. It's not just like, it's not a control issue. It's literally your responsibility to raise them in the Christian faith. Christian children deserve a Christian education. And so you cannot just throw them into a secular education with these people that have been educated as leftist jihadists to come in and undermine everything that we believe and expect that to go well 6, 7, 8, even up into high school. It's nonsense to me. I don't buy it.
Right. I completely agree. One of the arguments too that I think proponents of public education use a lot is the socialization argument. And first and foremost, you already talked, your analogy, or I should say your anecdote with the Amish, and the purple hairs. I think that that already shows that if my kids are going to be weird, because they are homeschooled or private schooled, if normal looks like that, I don't want them to be normal. But even so, an argument that I heard recently, I think it was Brian Sauvé actually was the one that I was listening to him speak on this. He was talking about how in the case of private Christian education, one of the blessings of doing a private Christian education is that socialization, but in a good way. There is such thing as proper socialization. If our culture, I think you would agree with me, if our culture was healthy and still majorly Christian, I think I wouldn't have much problem sending our kids to public school, knowing that 80% of their teachers are going to be Christians. The 20% that aren't are a mixed bag. They're not even all necessarily an organized minority trying to sway the 80%. They're kind of the odd ones out. My children are also getting additional help at home from mom and dad in our regular family dinners and our family worship, and then of course we go to a great biblically faithful church. The idea of public school doesn't sound very scary in that positive world setting, but at the end of the day, that's not our situation. But the blessings of a private Christian education is you can replicate that to a degree. And so one of the benefits of of that scenario is having a shared canon. When individuals are going to school in the same community with other fellow Christians who are all reading from the same books and from the same history textbooks, they are going to have a shared canon. Meaning, when they're arguing and debating as adults on what way the community should go, they have the ability to articulate and share ideas in a way that they all understand because they have that shared canon. So I think that there's a great argument to be made about private Christian education. If you have a great Christian school in your area, and if you don't, you might be able to start one. There's a lot of churches that Monday through Friday are empty buildings with tons of square footage, and talk to your local pastors. You might be surprised what pastors would be willing to partner with you on that, and you might be able to start the great private Christian education in your area. Or if you need to, homeschool. My wife and I are still not decided on homeschool versus private school. I think there's great arguments on both sides. But either way, at the end of the day, there is such thing as proper socialization. But again, that's us as parents choosing to put our children in a pocket of high capacity Christians, so that they can be incubated and ready to go for the real world. Not because we're sheltering them from it, but because we're preparing them for it. Excuse me.
Yeah, and this idea of socialization is very important for people. I mean, it's important not just for young people, for adults too. Now we have adults that are, living by themselves, just watching Netflix, ordering Uber Eats in urban areas. It's not healthy to live that way. So of course, socialization is important, but it's a matter of what way of life are we raising these kids into? What customs, what traditions, what manners are we raising them into? And at a good Christian school or even in a homeschool co-op, there's tons of opportunities for socialization. And there's still rec league sports. I mean, sorry, I'm getting heated. This idea that these kids will not be socialized if they don't go to public school, it's a fallacy. It's not proven by data. And even if let's say it's true, it's not, but let's say it's true that homeschool kids are awkward. This is the trope against homeschool kids. They're awkward. They don't really know how to socialize. Whatever. Like, why would I want them to be socialized into getting purple hair and wearing short skirts and watching pornography on their iPhone? Why would I want them to be exposed to that? I want them to be socialized into the Christian way of life in every form and facet. If they don't know how to look somebody in the eye and shake their hand, that's on you. Like, that's your job as a parent. It's not the school's job to teach them how to be healthy, mature adults later on in life. You should teach them good manners, good etiquette, these kind of things. And there's all sorts of supplemental material that you can provide for them. I, for one, I still went to Christian school, but my parents wanted me to go to cotillion. And in my area, they had cotillion. And you would go and you learn dances, you learn table settings, you learn how to ask a girl to dance, you learn how to show respect and honor. There's all sorts of supplemental materials that you can take advantage of that I think a lot of people just don't either don't think it's there, or it's just easier to just go, well, my tax dollars. That's the other thing, man. Our tax dollars go to fund these public schools that are teaching these wicked ideologies, and it's sickening. And then when we try to speak up about public schools, they're like, you don't even have kids here. I'm like, it doesn't matter. My money is going to fund this nonsense.
Right.
So I have a right to say what happens with the money that I'm being taxed on to fund this nonsense. And so, yeah, this socialization argument I find is bunk, because these kids are being socialized. I mean, my kids are in a Christian school. The classes are smaller than a public school, which I think is great, but they're getting tons of socialization. They go to church, they make friends there. It's not an argument that holds any water to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it's unfortunate that we have to constantly have these conversations, but let's maybe talk for a brief moment, Chase, because you pastor a church and you've probably dealt with these situations much more than I have. But I don't want to bind anyone's consciences here. I'm sure that there are some individuals that truly do have a situation where they just don't know how they can possibly make homeschooling or private schooling work. Either they don't have the money, they don't have the time, a bit of both. So what kind of maybe advice would you give to those type of individuals? And maybe before that, maybe just answer the question, is a parent in sin when they send their children, to these public schools? And what kind of area would you maybe say that what principles should they follow to make sure they don't fall into sin? I should say.
Yeah, that's a good question. And no, I don't believe they're in sin. And that's, I think, going back to the article, I think that's what's interesting about the article. And for a lot of Christians, they're not able to think to the logically about like, okay, fine, author, let's accept your premise. Is there a point at which you would say it is unwise, to put it moderately, unwise to send your child to public school? I don't think these people can even conceive of that reality happening.
Mm.
Unless, of course, the school was somehow Christian nationalist, then it would be very bad. Or if it was an explicitly Christian school where they're sheltered, then we have to avoid that. But I don't think they actually like play out their arguments to the nth degree. But no, I wouldn't bind anyone's conscience on this. I would say it's unwise, just like taking your child to see Limp Bizkit or somebody in concert would be incredibly unwise. You could make the same argument that they're making with school. I'm going to take them to see secular concerts, so they have to be exposed to worldly ideology. But I'm right there with them. I bought the ticket. I'm standing there, and then on the way home, we're going to debrief. I'm like, that is just so like, it's the same. Okay, we're going to watch an R-rated movie with my kid. We're going to watch Game of Thrones so that they can see what everybody else is watching and talk about that. You wouldn't do that. Like, you wouldn't do that. And so I just think it's unwise. I think you're right. There are certain situations where perhaps they can't make it work, whatever it may be. Then you're going to have to be prepared to count the cost for that. And part of that cost is you're going to need to be very involved with parents at our church where they've had to face that situation. The parents are very involved in the curriculum. They're constantly meeting with the teacher when the teacher puts up, the communist sickle and hammer as if it's good, or when the teacher calls out and calls Donald Trump basically Hitler, or when the teacher says something about how nobody should own a gun. The parent immediately calls a meeting with that teacher and is in there. That's not an ideal situation. The parent knows that's not an ideal situation. So it does stem from a heart of like, I know what I'm doing and I know why I'm doing it. And I'm going to be intentionally more involved. And I'm going to fight back in that public school for my children. And then I'm going to supplement with additional books, resources, anything like that, where I can help my child combat these ideologies. I think that's rarely the case. I think more often is the case is both parents work. They want to maintain a lifestyle where they can take vacations every year. And so it's just easier to do public school. And I think that's really unfortunate. I sympathize with it because I'm a millennial, and it does feel like kind of we've suffered a lot of economic setback and a lot of missed opportunities compared to former generations, where we see our parents kind of trouncing around the world and all this kind of stuff. And I get the desire for that kind of lifestyle. I just think at the end of the day, when that child is 18, it would be much better for you to have never taken a vacation, for you to sacrifice for that child to have a Christian education, because ultimately I think that's what God expects of us, is for that child to have a Christian education. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. There are certain situations, all that kind of stuff. And so, no, I wouldn't bind anyone conscious saying it's sin if you do that, but I would say it's incredibly unwise.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, we're nearing the end of our time, but I did want to kind of ask one other question. What kind of responsibility do you think that pastors have to sort of address, the issue of a parent's choice in education, as well as maybe providing resources? Should pastors be actively trying to start these private Christian, schools? What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I think as much as the pastor can, I mean, it just depends on the size of the church. The pastor should be pastoring those families together and knowing kind of the spiritual state of the souls under his watch. And so the pastor should be having conversations. I would find it rare for it to come up biblically as like a, you know, banging the pulpit talking about this matter, but it will come up naturally as we talk about family and household codes in the New Testament, the expectations in the Old Testament, all this kind of stuff. So it's going to come up naturally, but just pastoral meetings, we had one family in our church that had to leave the area because they were in a public school and there were transgender kind of like story hour type things, plays being taught in that school, and they fought it and they couldn't win because the powers that be are just too large. And so rather than, staying and trying to find homeschooling or that kind of thing, they just moved to a more conservative county where they could send their kids either a charter school or something like that. And so I think the pastor has to be aware of these tensions and I think that's what makes me sad for a lot of pastors. They're not really like seem to be like aware of what's going on in the public schools. They're just kind of like, oh, well, people make different choices. And like, these are souls under your care. It's your responsibility. And I think, there are opportunities for pastors out there to either start a Christian school in your church or partner with a local Christian school that already exists, because there's a lot of Christian schools in America. You could partner, you could celebrate them on a Sunday. I think that itself speaks to the parents, where it's like, we're going to champion these local Christian schools. And whether you give them money or not, you're going to like let them come in and do a seminar on something they teach there at the school. And so I think there's ways to creatively partner, even if you don't go the full distance and like create a Christian school in your church, to where you're showing these parents, look, this is what we would hope you would be able to do, because this is what's good for the children under your care, because ultimately the children are under the parents' care spiritually. And so I think there's lots of opportunities. It makes me sad when I hear pastors who are either living under a rock or they've sent their kids to public school, and so they're just kind of like recalcitrant on like ever touching this issue. Well, I sent my kid to public school, so who am I to judge? It's like, dude, like, it doesn't, like, those were different. Either those were different times, or maybe you made a mistake and you should just own it. And I hope your kid turned out well and as a Christian, walking with the Lord and going to church. But like, we shouldn't, as pastors, we should model what we expect of other people. That's not performative, that's just biblical. We are supposed to be doing that. And so pastors can model this very easily, in my mind. And pastors, there's lots of opportunities to get as a pastor in to public schools to help those Christians be well equipped to share the gospel with students, so pastors can be on the front lines evangelistically. So there's a lot of opportunity out there for pastors to get more involved.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thanks, Chase, for coming by and letting me pick your brain for the last while. I appreciate it as always. Where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing, and maybe reach out if they have any further questions on any of the advice you've given?
Yeah, you can go to my website, jchasedavis.com. You can email me there. There's a form there. You can follow me on X at jchasedavis. You can find our church, the Well Church, boulderwell.org, boulderwell.org, where I preach about 40% of the time, 50% of the time. Me and Matt kind of split reps on that. But all that's there. And you can go to anywhere podcast or YouTube, Full Proof Theology. That's FULL, Proof Theology. And I release episodes weekly.
Awesome. Well, thanks a bunch for joining. And thank you, listeners, for being a part of the discussion. Really appreciate it. Feel free to go on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is home for my podcast. You can put in your email there for free. We'd really appreciate you checking it out. And we'll see you next time.